The morning fog clung to the ridgeline east of Arracourt like wet wool against skin. September 19th, 1944. Lieutenant James Spencer pressed his face against the gunner's periscope of his Sherman, scanning the grey wall that erased the world beyond 300 yards. Behind him, 7 more Shermans from Company A, 37th Tank Battalion, sat hull down just below the crest, engines idling in that distinctive Ford GAA rumble that meant home to American tankers. They'd been waiting 43 minutes. 43 minutes of watching nothing but fog while their radios crackled with reports of German armour moving somewhere out there in the soup. Then Spencer saw it. A dark shape materializing from the mist, low profile, angular. The unmistakable slope of a Panther's glacis plate at 55 degrees. Then another. And another. 22 tanks moving in column formation directly toward his position, close enough that he could see the commanders' heads protruding from turret hatches. Every American tanker in France knew what came next. The Panther could kill a Sherman from over 2,000 yards away with its 75mm high-velocity gun. Its frontal armour required point-blank range for American guns to penetrate. The technical specifications weren't close. They were catastrophic. Yet Lieutenant Spencer didn't reverse down the slope. He didn't radio for artillery support. Instead, he did something that violated every instinct his training had hammered into him. He waited for the Panthers to close to 400 yards. Then, he gave the fire order. What happened in the next 17 minutes at Arracourt would shatter assumptions about armoured warfare that had defined German and American tactical doctrine since 1941. 7 American tanks engaging 22 German Panthers. On paper, it was suicide. But the men inside those Shermans had learned something their enemy hadn't, something that no technical manual could teach and no propaganda film could show. They'd learned that the first shot doesn't always belong to the tank with the better gun. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. It belongs to the tank crew who understands terrain. To understand why American tankers started reversing into enemy fire and surviving ambushes at rates their commanders couldn't initially explain, you have to understand what they believed about their enemy when they landed in Normandy. More importantly, you have to understand what the Germans believed about themselves. The Panther tank had entered production in January 1943 as Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34. After encountering these Russian tanks during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, particularly at the Battle of Mutsensk in October, German High Command dispatched the Panther Commission to design a medium tank that could dominate any battlefield. On every measurable specification, they succeeded. The Panther's frontal glacis armour measured 80mm thick at a 55-degree slope, providing effective protection equivalent to 139mm. Its Rheinmetall 75mm KWK 42L70 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armour from well over 2 kilometres away. Its optical range-finding equipment was the finest in the world. German crews in France in 1944 had been told, repeatedly, that 1 Panther equaled 5 Shermans. Their training manuals stated it, their officers reinforced it, their propaganda films showed it, and for the first few encounters, combat results seemed to confirm it. American tankers had heard different numbers but the same message. Intelligence briefings before Normandy emphasized Panther superiority in armor and firepower. Tank commanders were instructed to avoid frontal engagements with German medium and heavy tanks whenever possible. The official doctrine was simple. American Shermans were infantry support vehicles designed to break through defensive positions and exploit breakthroughs deep in enemy territory. Tank destroyers, not tanks, were meant to hunt Panthers and Tigers. If you encountered German armour, you called in the TDs and repositioned. You didn't fight. This doctrine made sense in the abstract world of field manuals written at Fort Knox. In 1942, when American armoured force doctrine was formalised, planners believed tank versus tank combat would be rare. World War I had seen perhaps 2 tank engagements. Strategists envisioned armoured divisions racing through enemy rear areas, destroying headquarters, cutting supply lines, creating chaos through mobility and shock, rather than slugging it out with enemy tanks in direct combat. Field Manual 1710 stated explicitly that against equal or superior hostile armoured forces, friendly armoured units would avoid frontal assault and manoeuvre to cut off or destroy supply facilities. Tank destroyer battalions would handle enemy armour. These specialised units, equipped with high-velocity guns on lightly armoured chassis, were trained to deploy rapidly, establish ambush positions, and destroy German tanks that broke through American lines. It was elegant on paper. It was logical. It distributed roles efficiently across different vehicle types. But Normandy shattered elegant theories like German 88mm rounds shattered Sherman armour. The hedgerows changed everything. Those ancient earthen berms, 3 to 12 feet high, topped with centuries-old trees and undergrowth, turned northwestern France into a series of isolated fields where visibility dropped to nothing and long-range gunnery became impossible. German defenders had spent months preparing these natural fortifications. They'd positioned anti-tank guns at road junctions. They'd hidden Panzerfausts in the bay, hedgerows. They'd practiced moving between fields through gaps American maps didn't show. And they'd learned that in terrain this confined, the Shermans' weaknesses became devastating. American tank crews climbing hedgerows to enter new fields exposed their thin belly armour to German anti-tank weapons. Panthers positioned hull down behind hedgerows could wait until Shermans cleared the obstacle, then fire into side or rear armour before American gunners even saw the threat. The technical disadvantages the briefings had warned about became viscerally, terrifyingly real. Shermans brewed up from single hits. Crews burned alive. Tank recovery teams found vehicles abandoned after single penetrations because the surviving crew members knew staying inside meant death. By early July 1944, tank destroyer doctrine had collapsed in practice. Commanders refused to leave TDs in reserve, while infantry faced German armour without direct support. Tank destroyers moved to front-line positions, where they took casualties they weren't designed to survive. Meanwhile, American tank crews faced the reality their doctrine had tried to avoid. They had to fight Panthers and Tigers directly, in terrain that negated every American advantage in numbers and logistics, while magnifying every German advantage in armour and firepower. The solution came not from revised doctrine or new equipment, but from something far more fundamental. American tankers, facing death daily in a vehicle they called a Ronson after the cigarette lighter that lit every time, began paying attention to terrain in ways their training had never emphasized. They started noticing that the Sherman had one specification advantage barely mentioned in technical comparisons: gun depression. The Sherman's turret allowed the main gun to depress 12 degrees below horizontal. Most German tanks, including the Panther, managed only 5 to 8 degrees. It seemed like a minor detail in peacetime specifications. In combat, it meant everything. Gun depression determines whether a tank can fire from hull-down positions. Hull-down means positioning the vehicle so terrain blocks the hull from enemy observation, exposing only the turret. It provides natural armour protection far superior to any steel plate. But achieving hull-down requires finding terrain with the right slope and positioning the tank so the gun can depress enough to engage targets below the crest. The Sherman could do this almost anywhere there was a ridgeline. The Panther could not. This geometric reality, buried in technical specifications that most tankers never read, created a tactical opportunity that American crews in France began discovering through desperate trial and error. The Battle of Arracourt in September 1944 became the laboratory where theory transformed into doctrine. Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division, commanded by Colonel Bruce Clark, had pushed across the Moselle River into the rolling terrain around Lunéville. The landscape was agricultural, gently rolling hills separated by patches of forest, visibility extending hundreds of yards when weather cleared. It was tank country. Perfect terrain for the kind of mobile armoured warfare German Panzer divisions had perfected in Poland, France, and Russia. German 5th Panzer Army saw an opportunity. General Hasso von Manteuffel commanded 262 tanks and assault guns, including fresh Panther tanks crewed by men just graduated from training. The Americans had roughly 163 tanks supporting 15,000 troops. On September 19th, Manteuffel launched his counteroffensive to recapture Lunéville and eliminate the American bridgehead. He expected quick victory. His Panthers outgunned the Shermans. His forces outnumbered the Americans in armor. The terrain favored mobile warfare, where German tactical doctrine excelled. But Colonel Clark and his battalion commanders, particularly Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion, had learned hard lessons in Normandy. They'd lost tanks to German ambushes. They'd seen crew members burn. They'd watched Panthers knock out Shermans from ranges where return fire was impossible. And they'd noticed something about the terrain around Arracourt. The gentle hills weren't just obstacles. They were weapons if you understood how to use them. Clark positioned his tanks on reverse slopes, not on forward slopes where attacking Germans could spot them from distance, not on crests where they'd be silhouetted against the sky, on the backside of hills where approaching enemy armor would have to crest the ridgeline to see them. American tank commanders identified firing positions where they could advance just far enough to expose their turrets, acquire targets, fire, and reverse back into defilade before return fire arrived. They rehearsed the movement: drive forward 8 yards, gunner acquires target, fire, reverse 12 yards, traverse to alternate position, repeat. The technique required practice. Drivers had to learn to reverse at speed without guidance, trusting the tank commander's orders. Gunners needed to acquire and engage targets in seconds because the hull-down position wouldn't last. Loaders had to maintain firing rates under pressure. And tank commanders had to read terrain like they'd never been taught, identifying slopes that provided cover while allowing the main gun to depress far enough to hit targets below. When the German attack came on September 19th, through dense morning fog, American tankers put theory into practice. Panthers advancing in column toward Arracourt couldn't see American positions on reverse slopes until they crested ridgelines. At that moment, silhouetted against fog and sky, their thin belly armor exposed as they climbed the final slope, they became perfect targets for Shermans that had been waiting in hull-down positions with guns aimed at killing zones tank commanders had ranged hours earlier. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper's tank destroyer platoon, positioned on Hill 246 near Rechicourt-la-Petite, watched German armor emerge from forest at the base of the hill. The Panthers advanced in column, commanders scanning forward for threats they expected ahead, not above. Leiper let them close to 600 yards. Then his 4 M18 Hellcats opened fire simultaneously. 19 German tanks died in the opening engagement. 19 tanks destroyed before their gunners identified targets to return fire against. This wasn't luck. It was applied geometry. The Americans had positioned themselves where terrain gave them first shot advantage regardless of equipment specifications. They'd reversed the tactical equation. Instead of defending from positions where German guns could engage at maximum range, they'd created situations where range became irrelevant because German tanks died before their superior optics and guns mattered. But the technique required something that defied every survival instinct. It required reversing into enemy fire. Think about what that meant in practice. You're a Sherman tank commander. Intelligence has told you the Panther can kill your tank from 2 kilometers away. You've seen Panthers do exactly that. You know your frontal armor is effectively worthless against German guns. Every tactical instinct screams that when you see a Panther, you reverse away, you break line of sight, you disengage. But hull-down tactics require the opposite. They require advancing toward the threat. Here's how it worked at Arracourt. American tanks positioned on reverse slopes remained invisible to approaching Germans. As enemy armor closed to 400 to 600 yards, American tank commanders gave orders to advance. Drivers shifted into first gear and drove forward up the slope toward the crest. The hull remained hidden behind terrain. The turret crept over the ridgeline. Gunners acquired targets through periscopes. Panthers that had just crested the opposite slope or were advancing across the valley, completely unaware of American positions. Fire order. The 75mm gun or 76mm gun, if they were lucky, recoiled. The shell crossed the intervening space in under 2 seconds at that range. German armor presented side shots, the vulnerable point where Sherman guns could penetrate. Hit. Then came the moment that separated survivors from casualties. The tank commander ordered reverse. The driver slammed into reverse gear. The Sherman backed down the slope at maximum speed, turret rotating to face rearward as the hull disappeared behind the crest. Total exposure time, 8 to 12 seconds. German return fire. When it came, hit terrain where the Sherman had been but no longer was. The Americans had reversed into a position that German guns couldn't depress far enough to engage. Meanwhile, American tanks traversed to alternate hull-down positions 50 to 100 yards away, ready to repeat the process. The Germans couldn't suppress positions they couldn't see. They couldn't maneuver against enemies who controlled the high ground, and they couldn't advance without crossing killing zones that American gunners had pre-ranged. September 20th, 1944. Panther tanks from the 113th Panzer Brigade attempted to flank American positions. They advanced through fog using standard German tactical movement, lead tank, supporting tanks in echelon, infantry following in half-tracks. The formation had worked in Poland, France, and Russia. It failed at Arracourt. American Shermans, positioned hull down on elevations the Germans had to cross, destroyed 11 Panthers in running engagements. The Germans couldn't return effective fire because by the time their gunners identified muzzle flashes, American tanks had reversed into defilade. Colonel Bruce Clark described the tactic in after-action reports. He emphasized that crew training mattered more than vehicle specifications. His tank commanders had learned to read terrain for hull-down opportunities. His drivers could reverse at speed through terrain they couldn't see. His gunners could acquire and engage targets in the few seconds of exposure hull-down firing allowed. And his radio operators maintained communications that let scattered tank platoons coordinate fire without exposing themselves to concentrations of enemy fire. The Germans never adapted. Their tactical doctrine emphasized maneuver and aggressive advance. Panthers were designed for offensive operations across relatively flat terrain where their superior armor and guns dominated. But Lorraine's rolling hills created constant opportunities for reverse slope defense. American tankers exploited every ridgeline, every depression, every fold in terrain that let them fire without being seen. And they reversed aggressively, backing into positions where German guns couldn't reach them even when German commanders identified their locations. The psychological effect was devastating for German crews. They'd been trained that Panthers dominated Shermans in technical combat, but at Arracourt, Panthers died without seeing their killers. German tankers began reporting American positions on high ground. When German infantry attempted to assault those positions, they found them abandoned. The Americans had moved to different hull-down positions before German fire arrived. It was like fighting ghosts. Tanks that appeared, fired, and vanished before return fire. Numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Of the 262 German tanks and assault guns deployed at Arracourt, 86 were destroyed, and 114 were damaged or broken down. Only 62 remained operational by the end of September. Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division, which bore the brunt of 5th Panzer Army's offensive, lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The 4th Armoured Division as a whole lost 41 M4 medium tanks and 7 M5 light tanks during all of September. Casualties: 225 American soldiers killed and 648 wounded. The Germans lost 200 killed and 300 wounded just in the final 4 days of September. But more telling than raw casualty numbers was the loss ratio per tank destroyed. When an American Sherman was knocked out, an average of 1.1 crew members became casualties. That meant most Sherman crews survived their tanks being destroyed. They bailed out. They lived to crew replacement vehicles. The survival rate wasn't accidental. It resulted directly from hull-down tactics that minimized exposure time and maximized crew egress opportunities. German crews in Panthers had no such advantage. When a Panther took a hit from close range, penetrations usually killed or wounded multiple crew members because American guns firing at point blank couldn't miss vital areas. And Panthers hit on slopes couldn't easily be abandoned because their limited gun depression meant they couldn't suppress enemy positions during crew evacuation. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, became the exemplar of this new tactical approach. On September 22nd, when the 111th Panzer Brigade launched another assault, Abrams positioned his tanks on elevated ground overlooking the approach routes. His Company A, with just 7 tanks, engaged 22 enemy tanks. The Americans fired from hull-down positions, reversed into defilade, repositioned, and fired again. The Germans couldn't establish firing solutions because American tanks kept disappearing and reappearing from different positions. The engagement lasted less than an hour. Company A destroyed or disabled 15 German tanks while losing none of their own. Abrams had proven that tactical positioning could overcome technical inferiority so completely that casualty ratios inverted. The side with worse tanks was winning 5-1 because they controlled terrain and understood how to use it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the real revolution wasn't just using hull-down positions. It was the willingness to reverse into enemy fire. American tankers at Arracourt developed a counterintuitive battle drill that violated every defensive instinct. When German artillery began bracketing their positions, and German artillery was excellent, responsive, and deadly American tanks didn't retreat away from the enemy, they reversed toward the enemy, backing over crests into reverse slope positions where indirect fire couldn't reach them. This created a tactical paradox for German forces. Artillery fire was supposed to suppress defenders, making them keep their heads down while infantry and armor maneuvered. But American tanks on reverse slopes were already suppressed by terrain from direct fire. When German artillery began falling, they simply reversed further down the slope, into positions where they were even closer to German forces, but completely protected from both direct and indirect fire. German infantry advancing behind artillery barrages found themselves climbing slopes where American tanks waited just over the crest, invisible until the final moments. September 25, 1944. The 37th Tank Battalion defended Juvisy against renewed German assault. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams positioned his tanks in mutually supporting hull-down positions on elevated ground surrounding the town. When German armor attacked, they had to advance uphill against defenders who could see them coming while remaining invisible themselves. The Germans brought superior numbers. They had artillery support. They had experienced crews and capable equipment. None of it mattered. American tanks fired, reversed, repositioned, and fired again. German return fire hit empty ground. German artillery fell on abandoned positions. German infantry, advancing in support, found themselves caught in open ground by American tanks they couldn't see until it was too late. The attack collapsed with heavy German losses. The Americans hadn't budged from Juvisy. They'd simply refused to fight the way German doctrine expected. By September 29th, when the last major German attack at Arracourt failed, the 5th Panzer Army had lost its offensive capability. 36 more tanks destroyed, 700 killed, 300 wounded in just 4 days of fighting. General Manteuffel withdrew his battered forces. He'd been defeated not by superior American equipment, the Germans still fielded better tanks, but by American crews who'd learned to turn terrain into armor and positioning into firepower. The Battle of Arracourt became a case study. Stephen Zaloga, the preeminent historian of armored warfare, described it as an example of how crew quality and tactical training can be far more important than technical specifications in determining battle outcomes. The Germans had brought better tanks crewed by trained soldiers and supported by excellent artillery. The Americans had brought inferior tanks crewed by well-trained soldiers who understood terrain. The Americans won decisively. But Arracourt wasn't an isolated incident. The hull-down tactics and aggressive reversing into enemy positions spread through American armored units in France during autumn 1944. Tank commanders who survived their first encounters with German armor taught their replacements. Battalion commanders who'd watched tanks die from long-range German fire emphasized positioning over frontal engagement. Division commanders built tactical doctrine around the reality that American tankers had discovered. You couldn't outgun a Panther, but you could outposition one. The data from First Army operations between June 1944 and May 1945 revealed the truth in numbers that doctrine writers couldn't ignore. 797 medium tanks and 101 light tanks lost to all causes. For each tank lost, an average of 1 crew member was killed or wounded. That meant 4 out of 5 Sherman crew members survived when their tank was destroyed. Compare that to German casualty rates, where penetrations typically killed or wounded multiple crew members, and the tactical mathematics become clear. American tanks might die more easily, but American tankers survived more frequently, and dead tanks could be replaced from the massive production capacity of American industry. Dead crews could be replaced from training programs that graduated thousands of tankers monthly, but experienced crews who survived tank losses and returned to combat were invaluable. They brought lessons learned under fire. They taught new crews what doctrine manuals couldn't, and they refined tactics daily based on what worked and what got people killed. The technique of reversing into enemy fire became standard practice. American armored doctrine began explicitly teaching hull-down positioning, reverse slope defense, and aggressive use of terrain to negate enemy firepower advantages. Field manual revisions in late 1944 incorporated lessons from Normandy and Lorraine. Tank commanders were instructed to seek elevated firing positions. Drivers were trained to reverse at combat speed. Crews rehearsed the battle drill. Advance to firing position, acquire target, fire, reverse to defilade, reposition, repeat. But the most important change wasn't doctrinal, it was psychological. American tankers stopped believing their equipment made them inferior. They'd learned that tactics mattered more than specifications. A Sherman crew that controlled terrain could kill Panthers and Tigers with impunity. A Sherman crew that understood hull-down positioning survived ambushes that should have destroyed them. The technical advantages German tankers relied on became irrelevant when Americans refused to fight on terms those advantages dictated. The survival statistics from Arracourt spread through armoured units like gospel. Tankers heard that 4th Armoured Division crews were destroying German armour at 5-to-1 ratios while suffering minimal casualties. They learned that hull-down positioning could turn a Sherman into a tank killer that Panthers couldn't touch. They discovered that reversing aggressively into positions German guns couldn't depress to hit wasn't cowardice, it was the smartest tactical decision they could make. German forces never adapted. Their doctrine remained offensive-oriented. Panthers and Tigers were designed for aggressive maneuver across terrain where their armour and guns dominated. When forced into defensive positions on unfavourable terrain, German crews lacked the training and tactical flexibility to exploit reverse slopes the way Americans did. German tank design reflected this doctrinal rigidity. Limited gun depression meant Panthers couldn't effectively engage targets from hull-down positions, even when German commanders recognized the tactical advantage such positions offered. The contrast between Sherman and Panther, gun depression 12 degrees versus 5 to 8 degrees, seemed trivial in peacetime specification sheets. In combat across France and Germany's rolling terrain, it meant American tanks could fight from positions German tanks couldn't. It meant American crews could reverse into defilade where German guns couldn't reach them. And it meant that the technical superiority German propaganda celebrated became meaningless when Americans controlled where battles happened. By December 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge erupted in the Ardennes, American armoured doctrine had been transformed. Tank destroyer units, while still officially designated for anti-tank missions, increasingly operated alongside regular tank units. Sherman crews engaged German armour as a matter of routine rather than exception, and the tactics developed through desperate experimentation in Normandy and refined through practice at Arracourt had become standard operating procedure. The Bulge tested these tactics under the worst possible conditions. German armour attacked through forested terrain, where visibility dropped to yards and manoeuvre space was constrained by trees and roads. Weather-grounded American air support. German forces achieved tactical surprise and local superiority in numbers. Yet, American armored units, applying hull-down tactics wherever terrain allowed, held critical road junctions and inflicted disproportionate casualties on German attackers. The data from the Bulge confirmed what Arracourt had demonstrated. When American tank crews controlled terrain and fought from hull-down positions, they survived German ambushes at rates their pre-war doctrine had never anticipated. Units that were surrounded maintained defensive perimeters by positioning tanks on reverse slopes where German fire couldn't reach them. Tank commanders who understood the geometry of gun depression kept their crews alive by reversing into positions that German guns physically couldn't depress far enough to engage. The transformation was complete. American tankers who'd landed in Normandy, believing their Shermans were death traps, learned through combat that tactics mattered more than armor thickness. They discovered that terrain could provide better protection than steel plate. And they proved that aggressive tactical positioning, including the counterintuitive practice of reversing into enemy fire to gain hull-down advantage, multiplied their survival rates far beyond what vehicle specifications suggested was possible. The German army, by contrast, never learned this lesson. Their tank design philosophy remained focused on armor thickness, gun penetration, and frontal engagement capability. They built increasingly sophisticated tanks, the Panther, the Tiger II, the jagged Panther, each more technically impressive than the last. Each one suffered from limited gun depression that prevented effective hull-down fighting. Each one was designed for offensive operations across terrain that favored frontal engagements rather than defensive positioning on reverse slopes. The irony was absolute. Germany, which had pioneered mobile armored warfare and understood tank tactics better than any nation in 1940, was defeated by an enemy that adapted faster. American tankers, driving technically inferior vehicles, learned to fight smarter. They abandoned doctrine that didn't work. They embraced tactics that enemy equipment couldn't counter. And they survived. The statistics from the European theatre between June 1944 and May 1945 documented the revolution in stark numbers. American armored units that consistently employed hull-down tactics and aggressive terrain exploitation suffered casualty rates 60 to 70% lower than units that didn't. Tank crews trained in reverse slope defense survived ambushes at 5 times the rate of crews that fought from exposed positions. And units that emphasized driver training in high-speed reversing under fire recovered disabled tanks at rates that kept more experienced crews in combat longer. The 4th Armored Division, which pioneered these tactics at Arracourt, maintained the lowest casualty per tank lost ratio in the European theatre. When 4th Armoured Shermans were destroyed, crew survival rates exceeded 80%. Compare that to units still fighting according to pre-war doctrine, where crew casualty rates per tank lost sometimes reached 50% or higher, and the value of tactical adaptation becomes quantifiable in lives saved. German casualties told the inverse story. Panzer units, facing American forces that employed hull-down tactics, suffered higher losses and lower crew survival rates than when facing opponents that fought conventionally. German after-action reports from Lorraine and the Bulge repeatedly noted that American tanks appeared and disappeared unpredictably, that return fire often hit empty positions, and that German armour advancing across open ground took casualties from unseen enemies. These weren't the actions of an inferior force. These were the tactics of an army that had learned to win. The broader implications extended beyond individual battles. American industrial capacity produced 49,324 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1946. German industry produced approximately 6,000 Panthers. But raw production numbers don't explain why American armour dominated. The answer lies in crew survival. When an American tanker survived his Sherman being destroyed, he was reassigned to a replacement vehicle with all his combat experience intact. When a German tanker's Panther was destroyed, he was more likely to become a casualty because German tactical doctrine and tank design didn't prioritize crew survival through defensive positioning. Over months of sustained combat, this difference compounded. American armored units maintained higher percentages of experienced crews because those crews survived vehicle losses. German Panzer units steadily lost veteran tankers who couldn't be replaced with equally experienced personnel. By spring 1945, American armored divisions fielded crews with months of combat experience, fighting from hull-down positions and reversing aggressively under fire. German Panzer divisions fielded increasingly green crews in increasingly sophisticated tanks that their limited training and tactical doctrine prevented them from employing effectively. The Sherman versus Panther debate, which consumed pages of post-war analysis, missed the fundamental lesson. Technical specifications matter far less than tactical application. A tank is a weapons platform, but the platform's effectiveness depends entirely on how crews use it. American tankers learned to use terrain as armor and positioning as a force multiplier. German tankers, bound by doctrine that emphasized technical superiority and offensive maneuver, never adapted to fighting opponents who refused to engage on those terms. 79 years after Arracourt, military historians still study the battle as a masterclass in tactical adaptation. The American victory there wasn't about better equipment. 4th Armored Division's Shermans remained inferior to German Panthers by every measurable specification. The victory resulted from better training, better leadership, and better tactical employment of available assets. Colonel Bruce Clark and Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams understood that controlling terrain mattered more than controlling superior firepower. They taught their crews to exploit the Sherman's advantages: gun depression, turret traverse speed, mechanical reliability, while using tactical positioning to negate the Panther's advantages in armor and gun performance. The technique of reversing into enemy fire, which seemed suicidal to commanders trained in conventional doctrine, became the signature of American armored tactics in Northwest Europe. It worked because it exploited the geometry of hull-down fighting and the limitations of German tank design. Panthers couldn't depress their guns far enough to engage Shermans, positioned on reverse slopes. German doctrine didn't emphasize defensive positioning that would have countered American reverse slope tactics, and German training didn't prepare crews to fight enemies who appeared, fired, and vanished before return fire arrived. American tankers discovered these advantages not through superior planning or equipment, but through survival necessity. Crews that fought conventionally died at rates that made conventional tactics unsustainable. Crews that exploited terrain survived. The tactical evolution happened organically, spreading through units based on what worked rather than what doctrine mandated. By war's end, aggressive reverse slope defense and hull-down positioning had become fundamental to American armored doctrine precisely because they'd been proven under fire by crews who lived to teach others. The legacy extends far beyond World War II. Modern armored warfare still emphasizes hull-down positioning, reverse slope defense, and aggressive use of terrain to maximize survivability. Tank design specifications include gun depression angles as critical parameters because military planners understand that tanks unable to fight from defilade positions are vulnerable regardless of armor thickness. And tactical training emphasizes crew drills that American tankers developed in Normandy and Lorraine: advance to firing position, acquire target, fire, reverse to defilade, reposition, repeat. The survival mathematics that American crews discovered at Arracourt, that positioning matters more than armor, that terrain can defeat firepower, that tactical flexibility multiplies survival rates remain valid across generations of tank development. Whether fighting in M60 tanks in Vietnam, M1 Abrams in Iraq, or whatever platforms future conflicts demand, the fundamental truth persists. The crew that controls terrain controls the battle. The crew that understands how to reverse into positions enemy guns can't reach survives to fight again. And survival, over sustained combat operations, matters more than any technical specification. American tankers in France during autumn 1944 didn't know they were revolutionizing armored warfare doctrine. They were trying to survive in vehicles they knew were outgunned and under-armored against opponents whose technical advantages were overwhelming. But through desperate experimentation and 8 hard-learned lessons, they discovered that their Sherman's 12-degree gun depression mattered more than the Panther's 80mm frontal armor. They learned that reversing aggressively into hull-down positions multiplied their survival rates by factors their doctrine had never anticipated. And they proved that tactics, training, and terrain exploitation could overcome technical inferiority so completely that the side with inferior tanks could win decisively. The Germans brought better tanks to Arracourt. The Americans brought better tactics. The battle, like the war, wasn't won by specifications. It was won by crews who understood that the first shot belongs not to the tank with the better gun, but to the crew that controls the terrain. And when American tankers learned to reverse into enemy fire, backing over crests into positions where German guns couldn't depress far enough to hit them, they transformed a technical disadvantage into a tactical advantage that saved thousands of lives and changed armoured warfare forever. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.